June 19, 1944, 10:27 hours, 150 miles west of Guam. Commander Takahashi Iyozo stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser Atago, flagship of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's first mobile fleet, watching through Zeiss binoculars as the American task force maneuvered 40 miles to the east. Even at this distance, the scale was unmistakable. 16 carriers, their flight decks gleaming in the morning sun, arranged in 4 task groups that stretched across 50 miles of the Philippine Sea. What happened next would shatter every assumption Japanese naval aviation had built since Pearl Harbor. From the deck of USS Lexington, the new Lexington CV-16, an Essex-class carrier commissioned just 18 months earlier, aircraft began launching. Not the careful, measured launches Takahashi had observed from Japanese carriers, but a torrent of metal and men that seemed to defy the physical limitations of a flight deck. In 37 minutes, 95 aircraft roared off Lexington's deck. Hellcat fighters, Helldiver bombers, Avenger torpedo planes, one after another with clockwork precision. The Japanese observers watching through long-range optics couldn't believe possible. Takahashi lowered his binoculars slowly, his hands beginning to tremble. He had served on Akagi, Japan's finest carrier, during the attack on Pearl Harbor. He knew carrier operations intimately. What he was witnessing violated everything he understood about naval aviation. A single Japanese fleet carrier required 45 to 60 minutes to launch 60 aircraft under ideal conditions. The Americans had just launched nearly 100 planes in less time from one ship, and they weren't done. Across the task force, 15 other carriers were matching this impossible tempo. Within 2 hours, over 450 American aircraft filled the sky, a swarm so dense that Japanese radar operators initially thought their equipment was malfunctioning. Takahashi turned to his communications officer, "Signal to Admiral Ozawa. The Americans possess carrier capability beyond our intelligence estimates. Recommend immediate withdrawal." But the message would arrive too late. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American pilots would call it, was already beginning. By day's end, Japanese naval aviation would lose 600 aircraft and 3 carriers, while American losses would total 123 planes. The mathematical reality was inescapable. The United States had created a class of aircraft carrier that could launch, recover, and rearm aircraft at speeds Japan couldn't match. More devastating still, America was building these supercarriers faster than Japan could train replacement pilots. The Essex-class represented not just technological superiority, but industrial capacity so overwhelming that it transformed carrier warfare into a form of combat Japan had never anticipated. Within 90 minutes of that first launch, Admiral Ozawa's carefully husbanded carrier force, the last hope of Japanese naval aviation, would begin its death spiral. Not from lack of courage or tactical brilliance, but from the simple mathematical fact that American carriers could put 3 times as many planes in the air in half the time, and behind those 16 carriers already at sea, 8 more Essex-class ships were completing their trials, with another 16 under construction. The Japanese naval staff had calculated that America might build 6 new fleet carriers by 1945. By June 1944, America had already commissioned 9 Essex-class carriers, with construction times dropping from 20 months for the first ship to 14 months for recent completions. This wasn't war as Japan understood it. This was industrial annihilation delivered at 30 knots from flight decks that never seemed to stop launching aircraft. The story of how America built 24 Essex-class carriers in less time than it took Japan to replace a single lost fleet carrier, how they trained crews to launch 100 planes in 45 minutes when Japanese carriers struggled to manage half that number in twice the time, represents the moment when industrial capacity became more decisive than tactical skill. It's the story of how American shipyards transformed steel into floating air bases, faster than Japanese factories could build the planes to defend against them. And it's the story of how the Imperial Japanese Navy discovered, too late, that they weren't fighting the American Navy of 1941, but an entirely new form of warfare where production tempo mattered more than pilot experience, where standardization defeated craftsmanship, and where the ability to build ships faster than the enemy could sink them rendered traditional naval strategy obsolete. December 7, 1941, had proven that Japanese carrier aviation was the world's finest. June 19, 1944, would prove that American industrial capacity had made Japanese excellence irrelevant. The revelation began with that first impossible launch from Lexington's deck, and it would end with Japan's absolute defeat in the carrier war it had pioneered. The origins of Japan's fatal miscalculation lay in assumptions shaped by 2 decades of carrier development. The Imperial Japanese Navy had revolutionized carrier warfare during the 1920s and 1930s, creating the most experienced, best-trained carrier force on Earth. Their doctrine emphasized quality over quantity, elite pilots flying superior aircraft from carriers designed for maximum efficiency. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval engineering, ships whose crews could execute complex operations with precision that Western observers openly admired. Japanese carrier doctrine, refined through years of training and combat experience in China, emphasized careful coordination. Launching a full strike required meticulous preparation. Aircraft were brought up from hangars, arranged on the flight deck, armed, fueled, and launched in a carefully choreographed sequence that prioritized safety and coordination over speed. A typical Japanese carrier could launch 18 aircraft in the first wave within 15 minutes, but launching a full deck strike of 60 to 70 planes required 45 to 60 minutes. This was considered excellent performance by 1941 standards. The attack on Pearl Harbor validated Japanese carrier doctrine spectacularly. 6 fleet carriers launched 353 aircraft in 2 waves, achieving complete surprise and devastating the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The operation demonstrated Japanese superiority in carrier aviation, proving that their emphasis on training, coordination, and elite pilot development had created an unbeatable striking force. Japanese naval staff calculated that America, with its emphasis on mass production over craftsmanship, would never match Japanese operational excellence. These assumptions were reinforced by early war experience. At the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942, Japanese carrier operations demonstrated continued superiority. Shokaku and Zuikaku launched coordinated strikes that sank USS Lexington, the original Lexington CV-2, and damaged USS Yorktown. Though Japan lost carrier Shoho, the engagement seemed to confirm that American carriers, even when they outnumbered Japanese forces, couldn't match Japanese operational tempo. Midway in June 1942 shattered Japanese invincibility, but not Japanese assumptions about carrier operations. The loss of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu resulted from tactical surprise and fortunate timing, not from American operational superiority. Japanese analysts studying Midway concluded that better luck or slightly different timing would have produced Japanese victory. They failed to recognize the deeper lesson that American industrial capacity would soon render individual battle outcomes irrelevant. Vice Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, understood American industrial potential better than most Japanese leaders. He had studied at Harvard, served as naval attaché in Washington, and traveled extensively through America during the 1920s. His often cited warning about awakening a sleeping giant reflected genuine understanding of American manufacturing capacity. But even Yamamoto underestimated how rapidly America would apply mass production principles to carrier construction. His calculations assumed traditional shipbuilding timelines, where fleet carriers required 3 to 4 years from keel laying to commissioning. In 1940, the U.S. Navy had 7 aircraft carriers: Lexington, Saratoga, Ranger, Yorktown, Enterprise, Wasp, and Hornet. By Pearl Harbor, this had increased to 8, with Hornet's commissioning in October 1941. Japanese planners calculated that America might commission 2 or 3 new carriers annually, assuming traditional construction methods and prioritization of other war production. These calculations failed to account for American innovation in modular construction and assembly line techniques applied to shipbuilding. The Essex-class design emerged from pre-war planning that emphasized creating a standard, mass-producible fleet carrier. The Navy's Bureau of Ships, led by Rear Admiral Edward L. Cochrane, worked with Newport News Shipbuilding to develop a design that could be built by multiple shipyards simultaneously using prefabricated components. The design incorporated lessons from earlier carriers while emphasizing features that would enable rapid construction and operation. The first ship, USS Essex, CV-9, was laid down at Newport News on April 28, 1941. The design called for a ship displacing 27,100 tons standard, 820 feet long, with a flight deck 862 feet by 108 feet. The massive flight deck, larger than 3 football fields, would prove crucial to the class's operational superiority. But the real innovation lay not in dimensions, but in systems designed for rapid aircraft operations. The hangar deck measured 654 feet by 70 feet and could accommodate 60 to 70 aircraft, depending on type. But unlike Japanese carriers, which emphasized hangar operations and brought aircraft to the flight deck only when needed, the Essex-class was designed to maintain aircraft on the flight deck continuously. The flight deck itself became a parking lot, arming station, and launching platforms simultaneously. This seemingly simple design choice would prove revolutionary. 3 elevators, 2 deck edge and 1 centerline, could move aircraft between hangar and flight deck in 40 seconds. Japanese carriers, with their internal elevators, required 2 to 3 minutes per aircraft. This 5-fold speed advantage multiplied across dozens of aircraft created operational tempo Japanese carriers couldn't match. The deck-edge elevators, positioned outside the main flight deck structure, allowed simultaneous operations. Aircraft could be landing while others were being brought up from the hangar, something impossible on Japanese carriers with centerline elevators that blocked landing operations. The catapult system represented another American innovation. 2 H-4B hydraulic catapults could launch 20,000-pound aircraft at 85 miles per hour, enough for heavily loaded bombers to achieve flying speed within 80 feet. Japanese carriers lacked catapults entirely, relying on free takeoff runs that required 300 to 400 feet and limited aircraft weight. This meant American carriers could launch heavier, better-armed aircraft more quickly than Japanese carriers could launch lighter planes. The arresting gear system featured 8 transverse cables powered by hydraulic engines that could stop a 20,000-pound aircraft landing at 80 miles per hour within 150 feet. The system could be reset in less than 30 seconds, allowing aircraft to land at intervals impossible on Japanese carriers, whose arresting systems required 2 to 3 minutes between landings. These seemingly minor technical advantages accumulated into overwhelming operational superiority. But the Essex-class's greatest advantage wasn't visible in blueprints. It was the industrial system that could build them. Newport News Shipbuilding pioneered modular construction techniques that revolutionized naval shipbuilding. Rather than building the ship from keel to superstructure in sequence, workers fabricated complete sections, entire compartments with piping, wiring, and equipment installed, then assembled these modules using massive cranes. This allowed work to proceed simultaneously on dozens of sections, dramatically reducing construction time. USS Essex required 20 months from keel laying to commissioning, launching on July 31, 1942, and commissioning on December 31, 1942. This was considered excellent time for a fleet carrier, but American shipyards were just beginning to perfect the process. As techniques improved and additional yards joined production, construction times dropped steadily. By 1943, Essex-class carriers were being completed in 16 months. By 1944, the fastest-built ships required just 14 months from keel to commissioning. The production expansion exceeded all Japanese calculations. By mid-1942, contracts had been awarded for 9 Essex-class carriers, with orders for more being processed. Bethlehem Steel's Quincy Yard, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, Norfolk Naval Shipyard, and New York Naval Shipyard joined Newport News in Essex production. Each yard employed 15,000 to 25,000 workers, operating 3 shifts around the clock. The workforce included unprecedented numbers of women, who comprised 30 to 40% of shipyard workers by 1943. The standardization enabled this mass production to succeed. Every Essex-class carrier was virtually identical, with the same equipment, layout, and systems. Spare parts were interchangeable. Crews could transfer between ships without retraining. Damage control procedures were universal. Maintenance schedules were standardized. This uniformity, which Japanese craftsmanship tradition would have rejected, proved devastatingly effective. When USS Franklin, CV-13, was severely damaged by Japanese bombs in March 1945, repair crews used components stripped from other Essex-class carriers under construction, getting her operational again within months. Japanese carrier construction, by contrast, emphasized individual ship optimization. Each carrier was unique, designed for specific roles with custom equipment. Shokaku and Zuikaku, Japan's finest carriers, were masterpieces of naval architecture, but they were also irreplaceable. When damaged, repair required custom fabrication of parts. When sunk, replacement meant designing and building a new ship from scratch, a process requiring 3 to 4 years. The Essex-class commissioning schedule revealed the crushing weight of American industrial capacity. USS Lexington, CV-16, commissioned February 17, 1943. USS Bunker Hill, CV-17, commissioned May 25, 1943. USS Wasp, CV-18, commissioned November 24, 1943. USS Yorktown, CV-10, commissioned April 15, 1943. USS Intrepid, CV-11, commissioned August 16, 1943. USS Hornet, CV-12, commissioned November 29, 1943. USS Franklin, CV-13, commissioned January 31, 1944. USS Ticonderoga, CV-14, commissioned May 8, 1944. USS Randolph, CV-15, commissioned October 9, 1944. By mid-1944, America was commissioning 1 Essex-class carrier every 6 weeks on average. The rate would have been faster, except that the Navy deliberately staggered commissioning to allow for proper crew training and shakedown cruises. Japan, fighting desperately to replace the 4 carriers lost at Midway, managed to commission just 3 new fleet carriers: Taiho, Shokaku's replacement, and Shinano, converted from a Yamato-class battleship between Midway and war's end. The production ratio was approximately 8-to-1 in America's favor. The human component of Essex-class superiority proved as important as the ships themselves. Each carrier required a crew of 3,200 officers and enlisted men, including an air group of 110 pilots and 500 aircrew. Training this many personnel would have been impossible using pre-war methods, where pilots received 2 to 3 years of intensive training before carrier qualification. America solved this problem through systematic training programs that produced competent pilots in 6 to 9 months. The Navy's flight training program expanded from 6 primary training bases in 1940 to 28 by 1944. Advanced carrier training was conducted at Naval Air Station Glenview and NAS Pensacola, where Essex-class flight decks were painted on runways, allowing pilots to practice carrier landings on shore before attempting them at sea. This training pipeline produced 60,000 naval aviators during the war, more than Japan trained in its entire history. The air groups assigned to Essex-class carriers reflected American emphasis on standardization and mass production. A typical Essex air group in 1944 consisted of 36 F-6F Hellcat fighters, 36 SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, and 18 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, a total of 90 aircraft with spares bringing the total embarked to 100 or more. These aircraft, while not individually superior to Japanese types in all respects, were available in quantities that made Japanese advantages irrelevant. Grumman produced 12,275 F-6F Hellcats during the war. The rugged fighter could absorb tremendous battle damage and still return to the carrier. Its 6.50 caliber machine guns could destroy enemy aircraft with burst duration that Japanese cannon-armed fighters couldn't match due to limited ammunition. Most importantly, Hellcats were available in such numbers that losses were quickly replaced. The Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, despite initial mechanical problems that earned it the nickname Beast, became an effective dive bomber once issues were resolved. With a 2,000-pound bomb load and good range, it could deliver devastating strikes. Grumman's TBF Avenger torpedo bomber, carrying a single 2,000-pound torpedo or equivalent bomb load, proved equally capable. American doctrine emphasized using available aircraft effectively rather than waiting for perfect aircraft. This pragmatism, combined with overwhelming numbers, defeated Japanese tactical excellence. The crew training for Essex-class carriers emphasized damage control and rapid aircraft operations. Damage control schools trained thousands of sailors in firefighting, repair techniques, and emergency procedures. This training would prove life-saving when kamikaze attacks began in 1944. Ships that would have been lost with lesser-trained crews survived and returned to action within weeks. USS Franklin absorbed two 550-pound bombs that killed 724 crew members and should have sunk the ship. Heroic damage control saved her, demonstrating that American training produced crews who could save ships that Japanese damage control couldn't have saved. But the most crucial training focused on flight deck operations. The choreography of launching and recovering aircraft required split-second timing and coordination among hundreds of personnel. Flight deck crews, identifiable by color-coded jerseys, each had specific responsibilities. Yellow shirts directed aircraft movement, purple shirts handled fuel, red shirts managed ordnance, green shirts operated catapults and arresting gear, blue shirts were plane handlers and chock operators, white shirts provided safety oversight and medical support. This color-coded system, developed on Essex-class carriers, allowed operations to proceed with minimal verbal communication. Directors could coordinate dozens of simultaneous tasks through hand signals, maintaining tempo even in combat conditions. Japanese carriers, lacking such systematization, required verbal coordination that limited operational speed. The Americans had applied assembly line principles to carrier operations, treating the flight deck as a factory floor where aircraft were the products being processed. The launch cycle demonstrated American operational superiority most clearly. When an Essex-class carrier prepared for a launch, the process began in the hangar deck where aircraft were armed, fueled, and pre-positioned on elevators. Meanwhile, on the flight deck, aircraft from previous operations were being struck below or moved to the stern parking area. The three elevators worked continuously, bringing armed aircraft topside at 40-second intervals. As aircraft reached the flight deck, yellow shirts directed them to predetermined spots in a launch sequence optimized for combat effectiveness. Fighters launched first, climbing to patrol altitude while bombers were still being positioned. This provided immediate combat air patrol protection. Dive bombers launched second, followed by torpedo bombers. The entire sequence, from first fighter to last torpedo plane, could be completed in 45 minutes for a 100-aircraft strike. More remarkably, the ship could immediately begin recovering aircraft from the previous strike, even as the new strike was assembling in the air. Japanese carriers couldn't match this tempo. Their single centerline elevator and emphasis on below-deck arming meant that launching a full strike required an hour or more. Recovery operations required clearing the flight deck completely, a process that could take 30 minutes. The cumulative effect was that Essex-class carriers could complete 2 launch and recovery cycles in the time Japanese carriers required for one. This meant American carriers could fly more sorties per day, maintain continuous combat air patrol, and respond more quickly to threats. The operational advantage multiplied when multiple Essex-class carriers operated together. American task force doctrine grouped 3 to 4 carriers in each task group, with multiple task groups operating in mutual support. This meant 12 to 16 carriers could coordinate operations, with some launching strikes while others recovered aircraft or maintained combat air patrol. The system created continuous airborne presence that Japanese forces never experienced before 1944. February 17, 1944, Operation Hailstone demonstrated the Essex-class capability that would define the Pacific War's final phase. 9 American carriers, 5 of them Essex-class, attacked the Japanese naval base at Truk, Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific. The raid involved launching over 400 aircraft in coordinated strikes that destroyed 270 Japanese aircraft, sank 3 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 32 merchant vessels, and rendered Truk unusable as a major base. Japanese defenders at Truk reported that American attacks came in continuous waves that never seemed to end. As soon as one strike departed, another appeared. Combat air patrol maintained strength throughout the day. The defenders calculated that such sustained operations required at least 15 carriers. When they learned only 9 were involved, many refused to believe it. The operational tempo exceeded Japanese understanding of carrier capability. Commander Nakajima Tadashi, senior air officer at Truk, survived the raid and later testified to Allied interrogators about the psychological impact. "We knew the Americans had more carriers than we did. What we didn't know was that each of their carriers could operate with the efficiency of 2 or 3 of ours. The aircraft never stopped coming. We would repel one attack, damage several aircraft, and feel momentary relief. Then radar showed another strike inbound, then another. It wasn't combat, it was industrial execution." The raids continued for 2 days, with American carriers launching strikes around the clock. Night operations, impossible for Japanese carriers without specialized training and equipment, were routine for the Americans. Radar-equipped F-6F Hellcats flew night combat air patrol. TBF Avengers made night bombing runs. The psychological effect on Japanese defenders was devastating. They couldn't rest, couldn't repair damage, couldn't regroup. The Americans owned day and night, had eliminated the traditional rhythm of naval combat where both sides could recover between engagements. Japanese naval intelligence compiled detailed reports on the Truk raid, trying to understand American operational capability. The analysis concluded that American carriers possessed double the sortie rate of Japanese carriers, could launch strikes twice as quickly, and could recover aircraft in half the time. These advantages, the report noted, made numerical comparisons misleading. 9 American carriers effectively equaled 18 Japanese carriers in operational capability. But this analysis reached headquarters after most of Japan's carrier aviation had been destroyed. The lessons came too late to change doctrine, too late to redesign carriers, too late to matter. The report's final paragraph, written by an officer whose name remains unknown, captured the hopelessness of Japan's situation. "The Americans have built a class of carrier that has made our carrier doctrine obsolete. We cannot match their launch tempo, cannot sustain operations at their pace, cannot build replacements at their rate. We face not numerical superiority, but systematic superiority. Every aspect of their carrier operations exceeds ours. This cannot be overcome through training or tactics. We have lost the carrier war." The Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19, 1944, would prove this assessment tragically accurate. Admiral Ozawa's first mobile fleet represented Japan's last major carrier force, carefully husbanded through months of training to replace the crews lost in earlier battles. The force included 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers with 430 aircraft, the largest Japanese carrier force assembled since Midway. Ozawa planned to use land-based air power from Guam and Tinian to supplement his carriers, giving him effective parity with American forces. The American Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance included 7 Essex-class carriers, 8 light carriers, and 956 aircraft. On paper, the forces seemed roughly comparable. Ozawa had 9 carriers and 430 planes. Spruance had 15 carriers and 956 planes. The ratio of approximately 2-to-1 seemed survivable to Japanese planners who assumed quality would partially offset quantity. What Japanese planners failed to calculate was that the operational tempo of Essex-class carriers would transform a 2-to-1 numerical advantage into overwhelming dominance. The battle would demonstrate that Essex-class carriers could launch, recover, rearm, and relaunch aircraft in the time Japanese carriers required for a single operation cycle. This multiplied American numerical superiority by a factor Japanese doctrine had never anticipated. At 0830 on June 19th, radar aboard USS Lexington detected the first wave of Ozawa's attack, 69 aircraft inbound from 150 miles. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, immediately launched every available fighter. Within 12 minutes, over 200 F-6F Hellcats were climbing to intercept, launched from 4 Essex-class carriers simultaneously. The Japanese pilots, many with less than 6 months training, flew into a wall of American fighters that tore their formation apart. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vratsu, flying from USS Intrepid, shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes, describing the engagement as similar to shooting ducks. The phrase wasn't boasting but accurate description. Japanese pilots, inadequately trained due to fuel shortages and instructor losses, couldn't compete with American pilots who had unlimited training time and systematic instruction. But the real disparity wasn't in pilot skill, it was in the system that supported them. As Vratsu landed to rearm and refuel, the process that would have taken 45 minutes on a Japanese carrier required just 12 minutes on Intrepid. Fuel hoses connected automatically. Ordnance crews had ammunition and rockets pre-positioned. The aircraft was directed to a catapult, launched and back in combat while Japanese pilots who had landed were still waiting for their carriers to clear the flight deck for recovery operations. This operational tempo meant American fighters could fly 3 sorties for every Japanese sortie, tripling effective fighter strength. The first wave of Japanese attackers lost 42 of 69 aircraft before reaching the American fleet. The second wave, 128 aircraft launched from Ozawa's carriers at 0900, faced the same hellish reception. American radar detected them 90 miles out. Hellcats, having landed, rearmed and relaunched in under 20 minutes, climbed to intercept. The second wave lost 97 aircraft with only minor damage to 2 American ships. Watching from Zuikaku, Commander Shirane Toshio observed American operations with growing despair. Each American carrier was launching and recovering aircraft continuously. Combat air patrols circled overhead constantly. Strike aircraft departed in coordinated waves. The Americans operated as if they had unlimited aircraft and fuel. Shirane had served on carriers since 1938 and had never seen operations conducted at such tempo. The Americans weren't fighting a naval battle. They were running an industrial process that happened to involve combat. The third wave, 47 aircraft launched at 1000, met the same fate. Only 7 aircraft returned. The fourth wave, 82 aircraft, lost 73. By noon, Ozawa's carefully assembled strike force had been destroyed. Of 373 aircraft launched, only 130 returned, and many were damaged beyond repair. American losses totaled 23 aircraft, mostly to operational accidents. The kill ratio, better than 15-to-1, exceeded even the most optimistic American projections. But the true measure of Essex-class superiority became apparent in the afternoon. Despite launching over 400 sorties that morning, maintaining continuous combat air patrol of 80 to 100 aircraft, and conducting anti-submarine operations, the American carriers were ready for offensive operations by 1600 hours. Admiral Mitcher ordered a long-range strike against Ozawa's retreating fleet, a 300-mile mission launched in fading daylight with night recovery anticipated. At 16:21 hours, Essex, Lexington, Bunker Hill and Wasp began launching a 216-aircraft strike. The launch sequence took 42 minutes, putting the entire strike force in the air just before sunset. Japanese carriers, had they survived the morning's slaughter with enough aircraft, would have required 2 hours for a similar launch. This 80-minute difference meant American carriers could launch strikes in windows of opportunity that Japanese carriers couldn't exploit. The strike found Ozawa's force at extreme range just before darkness. They sank carrier Hio, damaged several other ships, and destroyed 65 additional Japanese aircraft. But the return flight tested American training and systems. Landing on carrier decks at night required skill and technology Japanese naval aviation had never developed. Ships turned on lights, violating decades of doctrine to guide aircraft home. Landing signal officers brought in planes by flashlight. Of 216 aircraft launched, 196 returned, with 80 landing successfully, and the rest ditching near task force ships where they were rescued. This 92% recovery rate at night under combat conditions after a 600-mile mission demonstrated capabilities that Japanese observers monitoring radio traffic couldn't believe possible. Admiral Ozawa, his force shattered, retreated toward Okinawa, having lost 3 carriers, over 600 aircraft, and most importantly, the majority of his trained air crews. The mobile fleet would never again mount a major operation. American losses: 1 battleship slightly damaged, 123 aircraft lost mostly to operational causes, and 76 aircrew. The lopsided nature of the I engagement earned it the nickname the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot from American pilots, who found the combat disturbingly easy. Japanese naval staff reviewing the battle reports struggled to comprehend what had occurred. The mathematics made no sense according to their doctrine. How could American carriers launch strikes, maintain combat air patrol, and conduct recovery operations simultaneously? How could they launch 200 aircraft in minutes when Japanese carriers required an hour? How could they recover aircraft at night when Japanese pilots rarely practiced night landings even in peacetime? Captain Omai Toshikazu, assigned to analyze the Philippine Sea battle, delivered a report that headquarters initially rejected as defeatist exaggeration. The Americans have revolutionized carrier operations through systematization we never anticipated. Their flight decks operate as assembly lines. Their training produces competent rather than excellent pilots, but produces them in unlimited quantities. Their carriers are individually less elegant than ours, but operate with double our efficiency. Most critically, they possess enough carriers that losses don't matter. We cannot win a carrier war against such industrial capacity. The report sat in files for 3 weeks before Admiral Toyoda Soemu, commander of the combined fleet, read it and demanded an immediate conference. At that August meeting, Omai presented evidence that shattered remaining illusions about competitive carrier operations. The Americans now have 18 fleet carriers operational, with 8 more under construction. They can launch 100 aircraft per carrier in 45 minutes or less. They maintain continuous operations that our carriers cannot match. They train replacement pilots faster than we can kill them. There is no tactical solution to this strategic disparity. The room fell silent as officers absorbed implications that invalidated their entire careers. Japanese naval doctrine, developed over 2 decades, emphasized quality over quantity. Elite forces defeating numerically superior enemies through training and skill. The Americans had achieved both quality and quantity, creating systems that produced excellence through standardization. The carefully cultivated Japanese advantages in pilot training, carrier operations, and aircraft quality had been rendered irrelevant by American industrial capacity. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 demonstrated that Philippine Sea wasn't an aberration, but the new reality of Pacific carrier warfare. Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet included 8 Essex-class carriers with 787 aircraft. When Japanese carrier forces appeared as part of a complex multi-pronged attack, the Essex-class carriers responded with devastating efficiency. On October 24th, American carriers launched 259 sorties against Vice Admiral Kurita's center force, damaging battleship Musashi so severely she sank with over 1,000 crew members. The next day, October 25th, when Admiral Ozawa's depleted carrier force appeared as part of a decoy operation, Halsey's carriers launched 6 full strikes totaling 527 sorties that sank 4 Japanese carriers, Zuikaku, Chitose, Chiyoda, and Zuiho. The strikes were launched with such speed that Japanese defenders reported continuous attack with no pause for recovery operations. Observers on Zuikaku, Japan's last Pearl Harbor veteran carrier, watched in disbelief as wave after wave of American aircraft appeared overhead. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura Toshi, senior surviving officer from Zuikaku, later described the carrier's final moments in testimony that revealed Japanese awareness of their obsolescence. "We fought well. Our anti-aircraft fire was accurate. Our damage control was excellent by our standards, but the Americans attacked in such numbers that our defenses were overwhelmed. They could afford to lose aircraft. We shot down many, perhaps 30 or more, attacking our ship alone. It didn't matter. More kept coming. When we finally sank, American carriers were still launching strikes against other targets. They operated as if they had infinite aircraft. For all practical purposes, they did." The battle off Cape Engano, as the carrier action was designated, resulted in complete destruction of Japanese carrier aviation as an offensive force. 4 carriers sunk, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, and most critically, the few remaining experienced aircrew killed or captured. American losses: 1 light carrier Princeton sunk by land-based aircraft, 162 aircraft, and 114 aircrew. The disparity was so overwhelming that post-war historians debated whether to classify Leyte Gulf as a battle or an execution. The introduction of kamikaze attacks beginning at Leyte revealed Japanese recognition that conventional carrier warfare against Essex-class carriers was hopeless. If Japan couldn't match American launch tempo, couldn't replace losses, couldn't train pilots fast enough, then perhaps sacrificing pilots in suicide attacks would be more effective than conventional operations. The logic was brutal but mathematically sound. A kamikaze attack required minimal training, weeks rather than years, and if successful, achieved damage disproportionate to resources invested. The Essex-class carriers would face kamikaze attacks throughout 1945, testing whether their superior operations and damage control could withstand weapons that required no return capability. USS Franklin absorbed 2 550-pound bombs from a kamikaze on March 19, 1945, causing massive casualties and fires that should have sunk the ship. But the damage control training that emphasized rapid response and systematic firefighting saved her. Within hours, fires were contained. Within days, she was under tow. Within months, she was repaired and operational. USS Bunker Hill suffered kamikaze hits on May 11, 1945, that killed 393 crew members and caused catastrophic fires. Again, damage control saved the ship. USS Enterprise, the most decorated carrier of the war, survived multiple kamikaze hits through combinations of armor, compartmentalization, and trained crews. The Essex-class demonstrated that American industrial capacity extended beyond production numbers to creating ships that could absorb tremendous punishment and survive. Japanese naval officers analyzing kamikaze effectiveness reached grim conclusions. Even suicide attacks couldn't sink Essex-class carriers reliably. The ships were too well built, too heavily defended, crewed by too many well-trained damage control personnel. Captain Inoguchi Rikihei, who helped develop kamikaze tactics, wrote in his diary before his own death in a kamikaze attack, "We created these tactics because conventional warfare against American carriers is impossible. But even kamikaze attacks only damage them temporarily. They repair quickly, return to action, and are replaced if sunk. We sacrifice our best young men to delay the inevitable by weeks. This is not strategy, it is desperation. The statistical reality of Essex-class production and operation proved Inaguchi's assessment accurate. By war's end, the United States had commissioned 17 Essex-class carriers, with 7 more completed, too late for combat, and 8 under construction when Japan surrendered. This 24-ship building program, completed in under 4 years, exceeded Japan's total fleet carrier production from 1920 to 1945. The construction rate, faster than 1 ship every 2 months at peak, demonstrated industrial capacity that rendered traditional naval calculations obsolete. The operational statistics proved equally overwhelming. Essex-class carriers flew approximately 600,000 combat sorties during the war, dropped over 500,000 tons of ordnance, and shot down over 5,000 Japanese aircraft. They participated in every major Pacific carrier action from November 1943 onward, operating with reliability that Japanese carriers never achieved. The maintenance philosophy that emphasized replacement over repair meant American carriers maintained higher operational readiness than Japanese carriers that required extensive yard time for each repair. The human cost told the story most poignantly. The United States Navy trained approximately 60,000 pilots during World War II, more than enough to replace combat losses and expand carrier operations simultaneously. Japan trained approximately 25,000 pilots total, from 1930 to 1945, many of whom died in the first year of war when training pipelines couldn't replace them. By 1945, American carrier air groups included veteran pilots with 200 to 300 combat hours flying alongside adequately trained newcomers. Japanese carrier air groups, when they existed at all, consisted almost entirely of minimally trained pilots with less than 100 total flight hours. The Battle of Okinawa from April to June 1945 represented the Essex-class carrier's final and most sustained operation. 14 American carriers, including 9 Essex-class, maintained continuous operations for 3 months, despite kamikaze attacks that damaged several ships. The carriers flew over 41,000 sorties, more than Japan's entire naval aviation flew during the entire war. They maintained combat air patrol continuously, launched strikes daily, and provided close air support to ground forces. The operation demonstrated that American carriers had transcended being naval weapons to become floating air bases that could support sustained ground operations. Captain Fuchida Mitsuo, who had led the Pearl Harbor attack and survived to witness Okinawa from shore bases, wrote in his post-war memoir, "At Okinawa, I watched American carriers that operated for months without returning to port. They were supplied at sea, repaired at sea, and maintained air operations continuously. This capability exceeded anything we imagined possible in 1941. We thought we had revolutionized carrier warfare with our Pearl Harbor attack. The Americans showed us we had only scratched the surface of what carrier aviation could achieve. By war's end, their carriers had become something we never conceived. Not ships that carried aircraft, but mobile air forces that happened to be based at sea." The surrender of Japan on September 2, 1945, aboard USS Missouri took place in Tokyo Bay, surrounded by the largest assembly of American carrier power ever gathered. 15 fleet carriers, including 9 Essex-class, anchored in the bay with over 1,500 aircraft aboard. The visual demonstration of American naval dominance was complete and overwhelming. Japanese officials signing surrender documents could see through the portholes the carriers that had destroyed their navy, bombed their cities, and made their defeat inevitable. Admiral Ugaki Matomi, who had survived the war as one of Japan's senior naval commanders, wrote in his diary that night, "Today, I saw the Essex carriers that destroyed our navy, each one capable of operations we never achieved, present in numbers we never imagined possible. I understood then that we had lost the war the moment America decided to build them. Our Pearl Harbor attack, which seemed so decisive in December 1941, merely awakened an industrial giant whose capacity exceeded our comprehension. We thought we had 6 months to win the war before American production overwhelmed us. We were wrong. We didn't have 6 months. We had already lost. The post-war interrogation of Japanese naval officers provided the most complete picture of how Japan had underestimated Essex-class carrier capability. Admiral Toyoda Suemu, the final commander of the combined fleet, testified extensively about Japanese miscalculations. We knew America's industrial capacity was great. What we didn't understand was that they would apply mass production principles to carrier construction with such success. We calculated they might build 6 new carriers by 1945. They built 17 and had 7 more ready by war's end, each one capable of operations that exceeded our best carriers. This numerical and operational superiority rendered our tactical skills irrelevant. When asked specifically about the Essex-class ability to launch 100 aircraft in 45 minutes, Toyoda fell silent for several moments before responding. That capability, more than any other single factor, doomed our carrier forces. We couldn't match that tempo. Our best carriers required an hour or more for similar launches. This meant American carriers could fly twice as many sorties per day, could respond twice as quickly to threats, could maintain combat air patrol with half the aircraft we required. We were fighting with one hand while they fought with 2. No amount of training or courage could overcome that systematic advantage. Admiral Ozawa Jisaburo, who had commanded at Philippine Sea, provided the most detailed technical assessment. The Essex-class incorporated every lesson of carrier warfare while adding innovations we never considered. The deck edge elevators, the multiple catapults, the arresting gear systems, all designed for maximum operational tempo. But the real advantage was systematic. They trained crews to operate flight decks like factory assembly lines. Every movement choreographed, every task timed, every procedure standardized. This eliminated the individual variation that Japanese tradition valued, but it created operational efficiency we couldn't match. Sozawa's testimony included a remarkable admission that revealed how completely Japanese naval doctrine had been overturned. At Philippine Sea, I was confident we could win despite their numerical superiority. I had veteran pilots, good aircraft, and land-based support. I lost 600 aircraft and 3 carriers in one day while barely damaging their fleet. The reason wasn't that their pilots were better. Many of ours were more skilled individually. The reason was their system. They could launch more aircraft more quickly, maintain more fighters on combat air patrol, recover and relaunch more rapidly. They were fighting with an industrial system while we fought with traditional military methods. The system won. The post-war technical analysis of Essex-class carriers by Japanese naval engineers revealed grudging admiration for American design philosophy. The ships weren't beautiful in the way Japanese carriers were beautiful. They lacked the elegant lines of shokaku or the graceful proportions of akagi, but they were supremely functional. Every design choice optimized for operational tempo and survivability. The large flight deck, the powerful elevators, the armored hangars, the sophisticated damage control, all indicated that Americans understood carrier warfare would be decided by operational efficiency rather than individual excellence. One Japanese report noted particularly the difference in damage control philosophy. Japanese carriers were designed to avoid damage through armor and speed. American carriers were designed to absorb damage and continue operating. When damaged, Japanese carriers became vulnerable. When damaged, American carriers implemented systematic damage control that often saved ships that should have sunk. This difference in design philosophy reflected deeper differences in military culture. Japanese tradition emphasized avoiding failure. American pragmatism emphasized surviving failure and continuing the mission. The long-term impact of Essex-class carrier development extended far beyond World War II victory. The design principles, operational procedures, and training methods developed for Essex-class carriers became the foundation for post-war American naval aviation. Many Essex-class carriers served into the 1970s, updated with angled decks, steam catapults, and jet aircraft. USS Lexington served as a training carrier until 1991, 48 years after commissioning. The class proved so fundamentally sound that modifications could accommodate technologies unimaginable in 1941. The diplomatic impact proved equally significant. The assembly of Essex-class carriers in Tokyo Bay demonstrated American power so completely that Japan never again challenged American interests. The carrier force that had destroyed Japanese naval aviation remained visible proof of what would happen if Japan resisted occupation or revival of militarism. More broadly, the Essex-class carriers established America as the dominant Pacific power, a position maintained through continuous carrier presence that began in 1945 and continues today. The industrial lessons influenced post-war American manufacturing. The modular construction techniques, standardization principles, and quality control methods developed for Essex-class construction were applied to civilian industries. The workers who built carriers built America's post-war economy. The engineers who designed carrier systems designed America's aerospace industry. The managers who coordinated carrier construction managed America's corporate expansion. The Essex-class carriers proved that American industrial methods could produce complex military systems faster and cheaper than traditional craftsmanship, a lesson that shaped Cold War military production. For Japan, the Essex-class carriers represented the moment when their naval ambitions died permanently. The nation that had pioneered carrier warfare, that had created the world's finest carrier force in 1941, discovered that industrial capacity mattered more than tactical excellence. The post-war Japanese maritime self-defense force built no carriers, relying instead on American carrier protection. This strategic dependency, chosen by Japan and imposed by America, reflected the lasting impact of Essex-class dominance. Japan had learned that attempting to match American carrier production was futile. The human stories behind the statistics reveal the true meaning of Essex-class superiority. In 1991, at the final decommissioning ceremony for USS Lexington, the last Essex-class carrier in service, veterans from both sides attended. Among them was Takahashi Iyozo, the same commander who had observed that first impossible aircraft launch from Lexington in June 1944. Now, 89 years old, Takahashi had spent 47 years reflecting on what he witnessed. When asked by a reporter what he remembered most about that day in 1944, Takahashi's response captured the essence of Japanese recognition of American industrial power. "I remember thinking it was impossible. No carrier could launch that many aircraft that quickly, but they did. And then they did it again and again, all day, every day, for months. I realized then that we had attacked a nation whose industrial capacity we couldn't comprehend. We thought we were the best at carrier operations. We were wrong. The Americans weren't better at what we did. They had created a new way of doing it that made our methods obsolete." Takahashi's companion at the ceremony was Charles Henderson, a retired U.S. Navy captain who had served as a fighter pilot on Lexington during the Philippine Sea Battle. Henderson had shot down 3 Japanese aircraft that day, including one from the formation Takahashi had observed launching. The two men, enemies in 1944, had become friends through veterans' organizations. Their conversation, recorded by Navy historians, revealed the mutual respect that replaced wartime enmity. Henderson asked Takahashi what Japanese pilots thought when they first encountered the massed American carrier formations. Takahashi replied, "We were shocked by the numbers, but what truly frightened us was the efficiency. Your carriers operated like machines, launch, recover, rearm, relaunch, continuous operations that never stopped. Our carriers were operated by craftsmen. Yours were operated like factories. We couldn't compete with factories." Henderson's response revealed American understanding of their advantage. We weren't better pilots individually, but we had better systems, better training, better support, and we had enough carriers that losing one didn't matter. You couldn't afford to lose any. That's not a military advantage, that's an industrial advantage. We won because our factories outproduced your factories. The final assessment of Essex-class carrier impact belongs to the historians who have studied the Pacific War for decades. The consensus is clear. The Essex-class carriers represented the decisive weapons system of the Pacific theater, not the atomic bomb, which ended the war but didn't win it, not the submarine force, which strangled Japan's economy but couldn't control territory. The Essex-class carriers, which could project overwhelming air power anywhere in the Pacific, which could launch 100 aircraft in 45 minutes, which could maintain operations indefinitely through underway replenishment, which existed in numbers that made losses irrelevant. Professor John Lundstrom, the leading historian of Pacific carrier operations, concluded the Essex-class represented the perfect convergence of American strengths: industrial capacity, technological innovation, systematic training, and operational pragmatism. Japan couldn't match any of these advantages individually, much less all four simultaneously. From the moment the first Essex-class carrier entered combat in November 1943, Japanese defeat in the carrier war became mathematically certain. The only variable was how long it would take. That mathematical certainty began with a single observation in June 1944. Commander Takahashi Iyozo watching through binoculars as USS Lexington launched 95 aircraft in 37 minutes. He had lowered those binoculars knowing that what he witnessed shouldn't be possible according to everything Japanese naval doctrine taught. But it was possible, and that impossibility was being repeated by 16 other American carriers simultaneously. The Essex-class carriers proved that in modern warfare, industrial capacity creates tactical possibilities that training and tradition cannot overcome. They demonstrated that systematic efficiency defeats individual excellence when scaled to fleet operations. They established that in a war of production, the side that can build more ships, train more pilots, and fly more sorties will win regardless of tactical skill or strategic brilliance. Japan had revolutionized carrier warfare with their attack on Pearl Harbor, demonstrating that carriers could project decisive power across oceans. America revolutionized carrier construction and operations, demonstrating that carriers could be built faster than they could be sunk, operated more efficiently than traditional doctrine allowed, and employed in numbers that transformed naval warfare from duels between warships into industrial campaigns where victory went to the side with greater production capacity. The Essex-class carriers launched approximately 100 aircraft in 45 minutes, a capability that seemed impossible to Japanese observers in 1944. By 1945, it was routine. The ships that made it possible, built in 14 to 20 months by workers who learned their skills during wartime, crewed by pilots trained in less than a year, proved more decisive than battleships that required 4 years to build and elite pilots who trained for 2 years. The Essex-class carriers represented industrial warfare at its ultimate expression: overwhelming, systematic, and unstoppable. Admiral Nimitz, in his final report on Pacific operations, summarized the Essex-class contribution. These ships gave us the capability to attack anywhere, anytime, and sustain operations until victory was achieved. They carried the war to Japan's home islands. They destroyed Japan's ability to fight at sea. They demonstrated American industrial power so completely that Japan's will to resist collapsed. They were, quite simply, the winning weapons of the Pacific War. That victory began the moment the first Essex-class carrier launched 100 aircraft in 45 minutes, and Japan realized they had never expected it was possible. The industrial tsunami that followed swept away Japan's carrier forces, their naval ambitions, and ultimately their ability to continue the war. The Essex-class carriers proved that in total war, production tempo matters more than individual excellence. Systematic efficiency defeats tactical brilliance, and industrial capacity determines victory more surely than military skill. Commander Takahashi Iyozo had watched that first impossible launch in June 1944 and understood immediately that Japan had lost. The rest of the war merely confirmed what he knew the moment he saw American carriers operating at speeds Japanese doctrine said were impossible. The mathematics were inescapable. The outcome was inevitable. The Essex-class carriers had arrived, and Japanese naval aviation would never recover from the shock.